Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Medical Cannabis, a pharmacist's journey from skeptic to advocate, presented by Paul Mavor, pharmacist, Medical Cannabis Research, Australia. I am Christina Mahalik of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box that appears on the screen. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Help Desk button located in the promotional board at the bottom center of your screen, or use the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're having a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Please join me in welcoming Paul Mavor. I will now turn the presentation over to him.
Hello, thank you. Today I want to tell you about my journey from cannabis skeptic to an advocate, and I've been a pharmacist for 30 years, and over that time I've never seen cannabis as medicine. I've purely seen it as a recreational drug, and over the last few years I've come a full circle and have been studying it. I've been travelling the world, I've been speaking to lots of scientists about this, and I've been to the US, Canada and Israel, visiting grow facilities, visiting laboratories, and it's a really fascinating area that I see of rediscovered medicine. And it helps patients that have no other treatment options in some cases, and it has a big future in medicine. And one of our first trips away, we actually visited the Cannabis Science Conference, and I really did think the first time I'd be going to the US, I'd be taking my kids to Disneyland instead of I found myself at Cannabis Boot Camp, and it was a fantastic event. I did expect everyone to be there to have dreadlocks and be wearing tie-dye, and I was quite pleasantly surprised. There was a lot of scientists there and they're doing some amazing things with medicinal cannabis. So first up, big disclaimer, I'm not a cannabis user. I've never used it medically, spiritually, recreationally or otherwise. My poison of choice is beer. I love beer. It gives me flawless dance moves and makes my jokes funnier. And this picture here is one of our first trips to the US, where we went to Portland, or Potland as I like to call it, and we went on a cycling brewery tour. It was a really fun day. We got to sample a lot of craft brews. And the very same company who did the cycling brewery tour also offered a cycling cannabis tour where they visited 3 cannabis dispensaries and gave all participants a joint and edible at the end. We didn't do that tour, but it looked kind of fun. And a lot of the harm statistics I'm going to be presenting to you shortly compare alcohol versus cannabis. Cannabis doesn't fare too badly, not that I'm going to give up alcohol anytime soon. So my education as a health professional in cannabis was along the lines of, if us pharmacy students were ever at a party and someone lit up a joint, we were to leave that party immediately. And no one ever did. It became kind of a running joke. But if you fast forward to modern day, one of my current pharmacists, her education in cannabis was presented in half-an-hour format by a policeman, which covered all illicit drugs, which I don't see as really scientific, and it's kind of like a nun giving you a class in sex education. So we're hoping to change some of that today. You'll laugh at this, but my first introduction to medicinal cannabis, what really sparked my interest was the most unscientific of journals, Facebook. I came across this meme which quoted actual death statistics from the US circa year 2012, and I was quite shocked at the results. Right at the very top, you've got cancer sticks and sitting on couches, the usual suspects that are responsible for a lot of people dying each year. Underneath that, my favourite, beer, which is quite a big toll. But the one that really surprised me was prescription drugs, largely pharmaceutical opioids, which are responsible for over 30,000 deaths each year in the US. And I see these as preventable deaths. It's a massive toll, and I'm told that that was in year 2012. In 2017, it was closer to 50,000. So it is, in the true sense of the word, an epidemic. This meme showed cannabis right down the very bottom on 0, and I thought, no way, it cannot be true. How can a drug that is that dangerous, that pharmacists have to leave parties because of, be that safe? And it turns out cannabis is very difficult to overdose on. You have to eat something like a ton of the stuff to overdose on. I don't quite believe the figure's 0. Some poor person out there somewhere may be allergic to cannabis. But it is very difficult to overdose on, and you have to have a very large volume to overdose on. There's very few, if no, recorded deaths involving medicinal cannabis. That doesn't mean all cannabis use is safe all the time. So, moving on. So, to prove a point, we pulled some Australian data, also from the year 2012. The very top of lists, lung cancer, which was responsible for a big toll. I'm not sure if you can read the numbers here, but underneath that, there were, in the year 2012, 577 people died in Australia from overdosing on pharmaceutical opioids, and right down the very bottom on 0 was cannabis. So there's a bit of a trend forming here. In terms of acute lethal toxicity, how this chart works, the figure on the left, which is always 1, is the amount of a drug required to give an effective dose. The figure on the right is how many of those doses it takes to kill you. Right at the very top is heroin on 1 to 6, which is the most dangerous. Alcohol sitting on 1 to 10. In practical terms, 4 beers might get you drunk, 40 beers might kill you. Further down, we've got caffeine, 1 to 50. And right down the very bottom, we've got cannabis on 1 to greater than 20,000. So 1 joint might get you high. Over 20,000 joints would overdose you. So if you could afford 20,000 joints, you may come close to overdosing on cannabis. Now, I always thought cannabis was highly addictive. It turns out it's a lot lower on the scale than I thought. The most addictive substance on this scale anyway is heroin, closely followed by its cousin methadone. Further down, we've got alcohol and nicotine. They're both quite addictive substances. And right down on the right-hand side is cannabis. Cannabis sits on 0.8 on the addiction scale. Caffeine is not on this scale, but if it was on here, it'd be 0.9. So in practical terms, cannabis is less addictive than coffee. Very surprising. Cannabis was widely sold in pharmacies circa 1930s. It was widely used for some of the same things we're rediscovering now, like chronic pain. It was used for childhood epilepsy, and it was used for cancer pain patients. And I've seen some of these bottles sitting in old shelves, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but a lot of these names I did a bit of research on, and there were pharmaceutical companies that I remember when I first started in pharmacy. And a lot of them have evolved and merged and are grown since then. And I pulled up the names, and they're now big pharmaceutical companies that made their start selling cannabis. They no longer sell cannabis, but they might well one day in the near future. What happened? Now, in 1934, the US legalised alcohol. That meant there was a big government department sitting around doing nothing. And previously, they'd said there was not a problem with cannabis use. It did not cause harm in society. But once they found themselves unemployed, it was a different story. And they went after cannabis, largely on the basis of the unscientific movie called Reefer Madness, and proclaimed that cannabis users were violent and sex crazed. At the time, the American Medical Association spoke out against them and said, no, we actually use this as a medicine. It's got valid medical uses, and there's a lot of other things where researching is useful. But they were overruled and cannabis was banned. Many other countries around the world followed suit. And in 1942, cannabis was removed from the US Pharmacopoeia. Now, the cannabis plant itself is quite complex. There's over 60 different ingredients. They include waxes, terpenes, the cannabinoids themselves, and chlorophylls. There's two main ingredients in pharmaceutical terms, THC, which is the bit that is psychoactive potentially, and CBD, which is non-psychoactive and it's got a lot of medical uses. So most pharmaceutical products will contain a mixture of these two ingredients. There's also a bunch of other cannabinoids, many of which are still being investigated. They haven't been able to be studied for the last 80 years because of prohibition, but scientists are slowly unlocking some of the mysteries. The endocannabinoid system I'd never heard of, but it turns out our body has a homeostatic system called the endocannabinoid system, which is only starting to be taught in medical schools now. It was discovered in the mid-90s, and there's two cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2. CB1 is mainly found in the brain, and CB2 is found in vital organs and the skin. Now, our body produces natural cannabinoid chemicals, anandamide and 2-AG, and they work on receptors in the endocannabinoid system and control such things as appetite, the immune system, and pain, which explains a lot about what cannabis does, because the cannabis chemicals mimics these natural endocannabinoid. So unlike opioids, there's no cannabinoid receptors in the part of the brain or the brainstem which regulates the heart rate and breathing. So it's much safer to give large doses, especially in palliative care, where you might need to increase the dose depending on how the patients are coping and how bad you need to treat certain conditions. Now, if you look at cannabis science, you'll come across this term, the entourage effect, which is only a theory that not one ingredient works on one receptor at one time. It's theorised that two or more cannabinoids work in conjunction on one or more receptors at the same time. Now, in medical terms, there was a great article published in January 2017 by the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. They're supposedly the world's biggest body of skeptics. There's a lot of Harvard-trained professors who looked at what cannabis can and can't do. And they looked at every bit of research ever done on cannabis and scaled it from being anecdotal evidence that was biased, high quality evidence in gold standard clinical trials with placebos, etc. And they came to the conclusion there was 3 areas where there was good clinical evidence that medical cannabis was of benefit. The biggest one being chronic pain, which accounts for about 70% of the people using medicinal cannabis. And not only does medical cannabis help the pain of patients, it also has quite a few other benefits in areas such as anti-anxiety. It helps with insomnia, it helps spasm, helps also in nausea. So rather than essentially being a gateway drug, it is essentially an exit drug from some pharmaceuticals, and whilst you might decrease the pain medication, you might reduce some of the other medications in conjunction with that. Now, compared to opioids, that 80% of opioids do not work in chronic pain. They're really good for acute pain patients, but for chronic long-term pain, they're not as effective. And a lot of people get constipation. Up to 90% of patients get constipation with opioids for pain. They're also highly addictive, and they also can cause overdose in comparison. So medicinal cannabis has got good benefit in this particular area. The chemotherapy patients, mostly there's some really good drugs out there to prevent vomiting, but when these patients experience a metallic-like tongue, nothing else works for. None of the other standard nausea drugs tend to be very effective. Cannabis helps that low-level nausea these patients feel when they're undergoing chemotherapy. In terms of MS patients, they get relief from spasm, pain, and they can sleep better at night time. Now, since the January 2017 study, there was a May 2017 study published in the New England Medical Journal on refractory epilepsy and cannabis, and they studied some Dravet's patients that had drug-resistant epilepsy that nothing else worked for, and they found up to 40% of them were seizure-free or greatly reduced seizures using medicinal cannabis. So that is the fourth condition added to the list of drugs that medical cannabis can benefit. There's many more under investigation. These are some of them. PTSD is widely cannabis is widely used for PTSD in countries such as Israel, Canada and the US. In Israel and Canada, the government actually pay for war veterans to receive medicinal cannabis because they know it helps them. It still requires a lot more research and a gold standard clinical trial. There's quite a bit of exciting research going on anti-cancer effects of cannabis. Also cannabis and chemotherapy in conjunction to achieve better patient outcomes. Now, one of the conditions I think is really exciting that is being investigated currently is Alzheimer's. Now, Alzheimer's is a massive condition that is estimated 1 in 10 patients above the age of 65 will experience Alzheimer's or dementia at some stage in their lifetime. And in pharmaceutical terms, we don't have many drugs to benefit these patients. We've got an arsenal of drugs, but no cure, certainly for Alzheimer's, and very few drugs short of tranquilizing these patients to make life easy for their carers. Now, there has been some low-level study and some anecdotal research that show medical cannabis may be of benefit in these patients. So I'd like to see a lot more research in these areas. Like any drug, cannabis has drug interactions. There's 4 main areas. At this stage, there's no major contraindications, I say currently, because it is a developing science and there may be something that comes up down the track. Cannabis affects blood thinners like warfarin, so whilst it isn't a no-no to take cannabis while you're taking blood thinners, you may need to check the levels more frequently. Cannabis is metabolised by cytochrome P450, so anything else metabolised by this route might need consideration. Cannabis also may cause drowsiness and lower blood pressure, so any other medications affecting this might need to be monitored. Pharmacokinetics is a really interesting area. Now, what's mostly been studied has been smoked cannabis and the chemical ingredient THC. So there's a lot more work going on in this area now. What we know so far is smoking cannabis isn't a very good delivery method medically. Oral tends to be much better. Now, when you smoke cannabis, you get massive amounts almost instantly, and most of it's eliminated within a short period of time, within a couple of hours. It may be in your body in trace amounts for up to a couple of weeks afterwards, but in medical terms, you only get an effective dose within 2 hours. So for chronic long-term patients, they might need all-day relief. So oral is a far more effective method to give medicinal cannabis. The stomach has a huge first-pass effect from the acid, and there is less bioavailability, but it will last longer. Sublingually is a great method to give medicinal cannabis. It's absorbed through the oral mucosa, and you're avoiding the first-pass effect from the stomach. A bit higher bioavailability. Rectally, you also get good bioavailability without the psychoactivity of THC. But commercially, rectal administration isn't that popular. I think you're going to see a lot more topical products in the future. The molecular weight of THC is less than 400, so it is permeable by the skin, and there are a lot of CBT2 receptors in the skin, so it does achieve good medicinal benefits. This chart here accurately shows the difference between smoking cannabis, which, as I said, is not a good delivery method medically, and that is because it only works for about an hour. You achieve too high a dose of THC, and quite often you get psychoactivity, especially in the first half an hour or so, which isn't ideal for patients who are taking cannabis medically. Their objective in treatment is to get help rather than high. So when you take it orally, in the blue line, it takes about an hour before it clicks in. You can make this a bit faster by taking it sublingually when it's absorbed through the oral mucosa, but you get good long, low levels over a 24-hour period, like a blood pressure tablet or an antibiotic, where the idea is to have a long, low curve. Still getting a clinical dosage, but you're getting good medical benefits over a 24-hour period, and then you might take another dose each day to maintain that curve and maintain the benefits medically. So in summary, I don't consider smoking to be a very good delivery method. Orally is far better. So in dosage forms, medically moving forward, I don't think you'll see as much flower or bud smoke cannabis. And in Australia anyway, there's probably only about 10% of people who actually smoke. So they prefer other dosage forms like sublingual tablets, capsules. You're going to see oral sprays, tinctures, and less so pessaries and suppositories. Now, here's a neat bit of technology coming out of Israel. It's a Psyche inhaler, spelled SYQE. There's a great video on YouTube. It's an inhaler being developed for cannabis that connects up to a smartphone, and that way the doctor can monitor the patient's dosage, and the patient can also have a record of what cannabis they're using, when, and to what effect. And it's a great piece of technology, and I think you'll see a lot more of it, not only in cannabis users, but also other areas like asthmatic patients, etc. This is a Canadian grow room, and medically, cannabis needs to be grown the same from batch to batch. That way patients get the same medication every single time. And this is really, really important because chronically ill patients need to have consistent levels of THC and CBD. And by growing it indoors, you're controlling the season. So the plants get the same amount of sunlight, or artificial light in this case, water, nutrients, airflow, pH, etc. And you're also preventing pesticides. And that's important because as soon as pesticides are introduced to the plant, they might be concentrated when you concentrate the oil. So it's important to grow them this way. Also, by growing this way, it means they get 6 crop turns a year. They can turn a crop in 6 to 8 weeks, which economically is important. Now, when they extract the bud or the flower, they use machinery like this. This is CO2 extraction equipment. They may need to further clean it up using ethanol extraction. On the jar on the left-hand side with the yellow muck in, that's the raw cannabis that comes out of the extraction. They may further clean it up and get rid of the waxes and the chlorophyll. And from there, the jar on the right is the good stuff at the end, which they will formulate and medicate to the patient in standardised dosage terms. Now, I consider cannabis to be a pharmaceutical disruptor. For some patients, it offers benefit where there's no other treatment options. It can help quite a number of patients, and there's some really exciting stuff being developed. I think you're going to see a lot more of it in the future as some of this research comes online. And it's a really, as I say, exciting area of medicine that I'm really enjoying looking at and travelling the world with. So thank you very much for listening to me talk about medicinal cannabis. I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for that informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question drop-down box located on the far left of your presentation window. Type your question into the box that appears on your screen and click the Send button. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for. So let's get started with our first question. Our first question asks, can cannabis cure cancer?
I hope so. There's a lot of research taking place at the moment, and one of the Israeli scientists I know is doing a lot of work in this area. He summarised it to me that it is a very difficult thing to quantify because there's 100 different types of cancer. All of them are basically different diseases. So he's testing every single type of cannabis on every single type of cancer and trying to get some answers there. Now, I asked him, look, how many strains, well, how many types of cancer do you hope to cure? And he said, well, realistically, he's looking at 4 types of cancer of the 100 types of cancer that he'll hopefully be able to cure. I know he's done some preclinical work. He's done some work on rats. Shortly be starting human trials, and there's a number of other researchers around the world doing work as well. As I mentioned, there's some really great work taking place in my hometown on cannabis and chemotherapy. They're looking at pancreatic cancer models, which has got a very low survival rate. And there's been some really good anecdotal cases they're basing their research on. So hopefully they will get some answers there and people will get some benefit.
Excellent, thank you. And our next question asks, what strains are best for pain?
I'm not a big fan of strains. I think in terms of pain, you're going to see more THC and CBD levels moving forward. A lot of the strains are purely marketing, where they've done a bit of work and research, and even though strains are called the same, they contain varying amounts of THC and CBD. So typically they're best for pain. Creates you need to treat all the symptoms. As I said, if a patient's experiencing nausea, you might need to include some more THC. But typically what we're seeing for the most common patients, they're getting a high CBD formula with small amounts of THC. And if you need more nausea control, you might need a higher amount of THC, like a 1-to-1 level. But there's some great formulas out there with different amounts of THC and CBD rather than strains.
Excellent, thank you. If there are no more questions, I'd like to once again thank Paul Mavor for his presentation. I would also like to thank LabRoots for making today's educational webcast possible. Before we go, I want to let everyone know that today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through June of 2018. You will receive an email from LabRoots letting you know when this webcast will be available for replay. Please share that announcement with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you here again soon at LabRoots.